Hi everyone, it's Steph and welcome to another video. I remember when I first started weaving the feeling of being overwhelmed by all of these weaving terms, especially when you're reading patterns. It can become really overwhelming, so I thought I would do a quick video on the 12 most used weaving terms and what they mean. Also, at the end, just a little bonus on the hardware of a rigid heddle loom and the different names that things can be called. I hope you enjoy. So the first 5 terms I want to talk about are all inextricably linked together. The first one I want to talk about is set. So set simply means how densely your warp and weft are sitting together in your project. And we use the reed or the heddle to do this. The reed or the heddle determines the spacing of your yarn. So for a thicker yarn, you're going to have a lower set of say 5 or 7 or 8. And for a thinner yarn, you're going to have a higher set of 10 or 12 or even 15. So for this particular yarn, if we set this at a 7.5 or 8 in the heddle, we want to use being a 7.5 or an 8. That will mean that there are 7.5 or 8 ends per inch for the spacing, and that is going to make a lovely drapey perfect fabric for a scarf or clothing. If we use the same yarn and set this at 12 or 12.5, then that is going to make a really dense or unyielding fabric. Think table runner or placemat. So set is simply the way that we determine what heddle or reed that we use to get the spacing correct and the result we want for our fabric. WPI stands for wraps per inch, and this is a great system of getting an idea of what set to use or what reed or heddle to use for your project. Let's look at an example. So I've got this little handy dandy Ashford tool, but you can easily just use a ruler or anything long that you can wrap yarn around that you can mark an inch off. So if I take this yarn and wrap it around this tool until we can't get any more within an inch, this gives me an idea of a base to start with. So this is 15 wraps, which means we need to make room for the weft. So I would halve this and that would give me a 7.5. So if I wanted just a nice drapey fabric, I would use a 7.5 or an 8 heddle. So basically you take the wraps, you halve them, that is your base. Now if I wanted a looser fabric, I would go lower and maybe use a 5 dent reed. Or if I wanted a more dense fabric, I would go higher and use a 10 dent reed. So wraps per inch is a great way just to get a base idea of what set to use for a particular yarn. EPI stands for ends per inch, and this is where the reed or the heddle comes into play. Across the slots and the holes together, that will determine how many ends per inch or how many warp threads we need to make our fabric. So an example, a 7.5 or a 7 dent reed means that there are 7 ends or 7.5 ends per inch. So that is across slots and holes. For metric, that would be 30 ends per 10 centimeters or 30 warp threads per centimeters, adding in the slots and the holes. For a 15 dent reed, this would mean that there are 15 ends or 15 warp threads across an inch, or in metric, that would be 60 ends per 10 centimeters. So this is important when we go to determine how many warp threads we need for a particular width. So if we want 60 centimeters or 24 inches, and also helps to determine how much yarn you might need. So I won't go into the math here, but if you want to know more, I do explain this in my How to Read Weaving Drafts video. So PPI stands for picks per inch or weft threads per inch. And similarly in EPI, where we're having a look at the warp threads for ends per inch, PPI is picks per inch. So this is how many weft threads that we have in an inch of fabric. For a balanced weave, we want the same PPI as we have EPI. So if we have 7 or 7.5 ends per inch vertically in our warp, we should aim for beating at a rate that will give us 7 or 7.5 weft threads in our weaving horizontally. So this brings us to ends. Ends refers to how many warp threads that we have across the entire width of the project on the Rigid Heddle loom. So in this particular project I've got on my loom right now, this works out to 27.9 inches. So if we times 27.9 with 7.5 dent reed, so 7.5, that'll give us 209 ends. So this is really important if you are indirectly warping your loom. So that means you're winding a warp separately and then slaying your reed separately without actually pulling threads through slots or holes. Mostly I just direct warp my loom because it's just so much easier that way. But that's where ends come into play. Terms 6 and 7 are shafts and sheds. And I'm putting these together because they are complementary to each other in terms. So for shafts and sheds on a rigid heddle loom, with one heddle is a 2-shaft loom. And then we create a shed by lifting up the heddle, and that creates the up shed. And then we lower the heddle, and that creates the down shed. So a rigid heddle with one heddle is a 2-shaft loom, heddle up, heddle down, creating 2 sheds, which is the space where we pop our shuttle to place our weft. Now, if we go ahead and add another heddle, then this adds 1 more shaft, not 2, 1 more shaft. So we can have a rigid heddle loom with 2 heddles, and this would create a 3-shaft pattern. So the first heddle would be heddle up, heddle down, that's shed 1, shed 2, and then by manipulating, we can then use the third heddle for that 3rd shaft. So we can go ahead and take this even further by adding pickup sticks. So you can have one heddle, which is 2 shafts, and then add a pickup stick, and that is your 3rd shaft. So you can use this for 3-shaft patterns. You can also add another pickup stick, so 1 heddle plus 2 pickup sticks for a 4-shaft pattern. You can also use 2 heddles, and that is a 3-shaft, and then add a pickup stick for that 4th shaft, so for 4 shaft patterns. Now this can get really complicated, so it's definitely worth actually learning via reading about how to use pickup sticks and a 2nd heddle, and how to use them in patterns. But it just goes to show the versatility of a rigid heddle loom, is that we can use pickup sticks, we can use heddles, we can even use heddle rods, which is just another area altogether. Weaving terms 8 and 9 are selvage and fell, or the fell line. So firstly, your selvages. These are the edges of your weaving. When you first start weaving, these can sometimes be the hardest things to get straight or even or looking neat. This just comes with practice. However, here's a little tip. If you have a lot of trouble with a slack warp threads on the edge of your weaving, then make sure that your weaving starts and finishes with your warp threads in the holes. This will really help. If the edges or your selvage threads in your warp tend to be tight, then make sure that your weaving starts and ends with your warp threads in slots. And this will also help you. Sometimes you'll read in a pattern to manipulate or do something at the fell line. And the fell line is quite simply the last weft pick that you've placed in your weaving. So that can be called the fell line, or just fell. The last three terms I want to talk about are reed, heddle and beater. Sometimes in patterns or magazines or reading or watching about weaving on a rigid heddle loom, you may hear the heddle being referred to as a heddle or a reed or even a beater. The beauty of the rigid heddle loom is that your heddle or reed is all three, so that your heddle is your reed and your beater. The reason it might be called different things is that in a floor loom or a table loom, the heddles are the tiny eyelets that are attached to the shafts that are then raised or lowered to create your sheds. And the reed is on the very front of the loom, which is attached to the beater. So when referring to a rigid heddle loom, you can actually refer to the reed or the heddle or the beater, and they all mean the same thing. As a bit of a bonus, I've just added in some hardware terms that I do get questions about as well. So this here is my samplet loom, which is 40 centimeters. I also have a 60 centimeter rigid heddle loom here. Sometimes I get asked how to tell the front from the back. With Ashford, they do have this little notch here, which is indicating the back. And that's just so you can rest it on a table or something in front of you. Also, you can see that the back is a lot shorter than the front on the heddle. This is my 60 centimeter loom. You can see it also has a notch indicating that's the back. And you can see the back of the loom is also a lot smaller than the front, because the front is your working area, so that needs to be larger. Some other terms you need to know is the back beam and the front beam. This is where you wind on your warp and your fabric, and it's attached in Ashford, it's attached with these little plastic ties, which is just called an apron, and then you've got your apron rod, which is what you tie onto. And of course, aprons can be these plastic things. They can be Texsolve cord. In some of the older rigid heddles, they're actually canvas. So that should help you just a little bit with those as well. I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, thank you so much for watching, and thank you for liking my videos. Thank you for all the lovely comments. They really encourage me to keep going, so thank you. If you wish to support the channel, of course, you can just like and watch. If you wanted to support monetarily, I have opened a Buy Me a Coffee, so that you can contribute if you wish, and I've popped that link in the description. Thanks everyone, and have a wonderful day.